Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Dolbow. It's my privilege to introduce to you our second session of plenary speakers. We are honored to be joined this morning by three esteemed keynote speakers for this second session. We have a wonderful panel that is going to help to address a key point that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon raised in his presentation, the centrality of climate action towards all of the SDGs, including SDG number 9. In our presentations today, we're going to hear about the urgency of climate action, and we're also going to learn about effective national and multilateral efforts. There's a question that I'm going to ask the audience to keep in mind, which is, given effective success stories at the national and international level, what is it that is holding us back from effective action on climate? I think it's similar to the question that Professor Fukuyama addressed and that my colleague Professor Jean Ooi asked in her panel, but focused specifically on climate. Our first speaker is Ambassador Chan-woo Kim. He has served as Korea's former ambassador for climate change and is an expert on this topic. He's also served as Korea's representative for Arctic affairs and Korea's ambassador to Brazil and Kenya. Now, he's a visiting professor at Gyeongsang National University in Korea. It's also our privilege to welcome today Mr. Erdenebold Sukhbaatar. He's a member of Mongolia's state great Hural and an advocate and legislator who has propelled Mongolia's contributions to science, innovation policy, space technology, and cultural preservation. Our third esteemed keynote speaker is Mr. David H. Kim. Mr. Kim is the senior advisor to the president and chair of the Global Green Growth Institute. Previously, he accelerated tech startups at Samsung's Economic Research Institute, as well as the Amicus Institute. He has also conducted groundbreaking research on nuclear nonproliferation at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to try to keep their presentation time to around 10 minutes because we're going to attempt to have audience Q&A in this presentation. So with that, I'd like to invite Ambassador Kim to deliver the first presentation. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be presenting at the Trans-Pacific Sustainability Dialogue this year. Today, I will share my thoughts on reforming the Paris Agreement to address climate challenges we face and move towards climate-resilient development. Additionally, I will introduce Republic of Korea's efforts to contribute to the global coalition to combat climate change. Climate change. There are various expressions defining climate change. Due to runaway climate change, our entire environment is in crisis, and our economic and social development are seriously threatened. If we do not take extraordinary measures immediately, climate change will become an unprecedented disaster that threatens human survival. When we move towards the 1.5-degree path that we have consensus on, we can achieve climate-resilient development. However, the opposite possibility also exists. To achieve the future we want, it is time for the international community to gather political will and make wise decisions. The sea level rise caused by climate change clearly illustrates the existential threats we face. We are well aware that small island nations are in a crisis to rising sea levels. However, we seem to be less aware of the risk faced by low-lying coastal cities and settlements. In 2020, nearly 11% of the global populations, 896 million people, lived in cities and settlements within the low elevation coastal zone. This figure is projected to exceed 1 billion by 2050. Infrastructure and economic assets in this area, valued between $6.5 and $11 trillion, are exposed to the 1 in 100-year flooding. In 2015, the international community adopted the Paris Agreement to address climate change. This agreement pursues a new approach, quite different from that of the Kyoto Protocol, and has been evaluated as launching a new climate regime. The Paris Agreement established a universal system where all countries, regardless of being developed or developing, are required to submit voluntary greenhouse gas reduction commitments known as nationally determined contributions. These NDCs are to be updated and submitted every 5 years. Despite these advantages, the Paris Agreement lacks mechanisms to impose penalties on countries that fail to implement their NDCs and to assess whether the level of individual NDCs aligns with the temperate goals pursued by the international community. The shortcoming inherent in the Paris Agreement manifests as two gaps. The first gap is the implementation gap, which occurs when individual countries fail to achieve their NDCs. The second gap is the ambition gap, which arises when the level of individual countries' NDCs is inadequate to meet global temperature goals. The unit of numbers shown in this slide is 1 gigaton, that is 1 billion tons. Considering Korea's current annual emissions are around 0.65 gigatons, you can imagine the magnitude of the challenge these numbers represent. To address the implementation gap, financial penalties for non-compliance would be most effective. The money generated in this way could be linked to the loss and damage fund established for developing countries. Non-compliance with the NDCs leads to more greenhouse gas emissions and worsening climate change. So this idea is logically sound. However, since the intent of the Paris Agreement is non-punitive regarding NDC non-compliance, it is appropriate to set the penalty at the level that promotes compliance. Since the launch of the Loss and Damage Fund at last year's climate change conference in Dubai, approximately $680 million has been raised. However, this amount is widely recognized as insufficient to support developing countries. Therefore, this shortfall could be supplemented with penalties for individual countries' non-compliance with their NDCs. The ambition gap issue is much more challenging than the implementation gap issue, because addressing it would require infringing on the voluntary nature of the NDCs. However, the severity of climate change makes it impossible to ignore this issue. Addressing this within the climate change regime is not easy. Therefore, it would be helpful if high-level expert group organized by the UN Secretary General could provide tools to assess the adequacy of individual countries' NDCs. There is climate change-related precedent for such a group, which functioned in 2022. Reforming the Paris Agreement would result in stronger climate actions by individual countries. If governments mainstream policies and measures for climate action across all sectors, the development and deployment of climate change technologies, as well as the mobilization of necessary resources, will become much easier. Let me turn to Korea's efforts to combat climate change. In 2021, South Korea enacted Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth Act, aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050. To achieve this goal, Korea announced an NDC targeting 2030, a midterm goal which aims to reduce emissions by 40% compared to 2018 levels. To achieve the 2030 NDC, Korea plans to actively utilize carbon-free energy, such as renewable energy, nuclear power, and hydrogen. This plan was also highlighted in President Yoon's speech at the UN General Assembly last year. Korea intends to share its experience and knowledge in this area with the countries vulnerable to climate change. Korea aims to ensure that over 70% of its electricity comes from carbon-free sources by 2038. Korea took its national circumstances into account while planning the optimal mix of electricity sources. Finally, individual countries' climate actions are crucial for moving towards climate-resilient development. For this reason, reforming the Paris Agreement, which is positioned at the center, is urgent. The political will of the international community must be gathered before the window of opportunity closes. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, for that thought-provoking and I'd say ambitious call to action and specific proposed reforms. Next, we have the opportunity to hear from Mr. Erdenebold Sukhbaatar. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, professors and esteemed guests. Before my speech, can I ask where is His Excellency Ban Ki-moon? Actually, September 15th, when I received the invitation to this beautiful event, and then I told my grandfather, he's 95 years old. Actually, he knows very well about 2 general secretaries from UN.
He will come back. He will come back.
Okay.
He's in an interview.
Okay. And then actually, my grandfather, you know, he knows very well about Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon. And then actually, he said that he's 95, and then, you know, my grandfather knows His Excellency's age. And 2024, this year, June 13th, he reached 80 years old. And then my grandfather just told me, please convey my regards, and then tell him you're still young to serve humankind, you know? Okay? Okay. This slide shows a map of Mongolia's geographical location. And our country's location is quite unique and characterized by extreme natural and climate condition. Because of climate change, Mongolia is grappling with 2 critical challenges: desertification and land degradation. The slide before you illustrate both the current state and projected future of desertification across Mongolia's landscape. This visual representation underscores the urgency of our environmental concerns. From this slide, you can see the climate change trend in Mongolia over the last 8 decades. Specifically, the country's air temperature has increased by 2.36 degrees over 80 years. And also, precipitation has decreased by about 7%, and the frequency of natural disasters has increased. The adverse effects of this climate change on socio-economic development are projected to intensify, posing escalating challenges for Mongolia's future. The graph before you illustrates the projected trends in greenhouse gas emissions, meticulously calculated by sector through the expertise of our professional organizations. The results are shown the following figure. Compared to 2010 by 2050 shows that emissions from the energy sector are expected to increase by 3.0 and 4.7 times, the industrial sector by 13.3 and 36.6 times. Then our state policy aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly with the 9.4 target. This slide presents information about our medium and long-term development policy documents. Figures summarize the key policies and measures taken in previous assessments and updated documents to determine the present and future measures to reduce GHG emissions in Mongolia. We have set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 27% by 2050. Then also, from this slide, you can see the main directions of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. Okay. This slide presents a comprehensive overview of Mongolia's sector-specific mitigation and adaptation targets as delineated in our nationally determined contribution. It offers a detailed insight into our country's strategic approach to climate action across various economic sectors. Here, information about some projects being implemented in Mongolia under the Clean Development Mechanism. Yeah, and shown. Okay, today Mongolia is making significant efforts to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change. I would like to highlight the following 3 areas. The first one is named the Mars 3 project. This is the newly initiated project. 5 years ago, we initiated this project because, like Mongolian Gobi, we have 24 deserts in the earth, and 7 of them cold deserts. Among these 7 cold deserts, the Mongolian Gobi is the coldest and hottest one. The arid, dry temperature, and then what's happening in Mongolia is we are creating a Mars Analog Center in Mongolian Gobi Desert, and we have great communication with the science agencies and space agencies also, with NASA, JAXA, ISRO, and ESA, and we are creating like a training and adaptation base. 2024, about in 10 years, humankind will settle on Mars, and then Mongolian, economy is deeply related with the mining sectors, but like 93% of our import is related with the mining, which is like we need to polarize the economics and the green economics. Of course, it should be sustainable development goals. And also science and innovation is extremely important to Mongolian future prosperity and development. And then Mongolian Gobi is one of the great treasure to humankind. Then we are creating like a special interest tourism bases in Mongolian Gobi Desert. And the first person going to Mars, who's Elisa Carson, she's just 23 years old, and NASA named herself going to Mars like first person. And then also she's advisor to us. And then Mongolian young generation is extremely, hard working on this Mars project. And then we have a new government, coalition government now. It's just 107 days ago we established new government. And then government's next 4 years agenda is like 577, goals. The 5 of them related with Mars project. And I'm the former president of Mongolian kind of NASA. And then actually this is an extremely challenging project. It is not only technological project. This is also a leadership project. And then also, Mr. Zandashatar Kwamjo mentioned Mongolia is between two giant countries, which is Russia and China. And how can we survive? And our adaptation, point is extremely challenging. Of course, we have lots of obstacles in economic field and political field, but we are creating like a humankind's reaching, unifying like goals to reaching Mars. That's the one point, which is related with the leadership and technology. And the second thing is, of course, renewable energy projects in Mongolia. We have several projects, and it is still improving. And the third one is 1 billion tree project. A few years ago, Mongolian President Hural actually he initiated the 1 billion tree project in Mongolia. Now, just His Excellency Ban Ki-moon mentioned about like implementation. It is very important case that Mongolia, as a nation, we are creating such kind of SDG-based projects in Mongolia. Briefly, I'm done, and thank you very much. And then final word is, this is not only, talks. I hope we are creating great opportunity to next generation. And the Mongolia is like one of the great nation who can support. And then also, personally, I would like to tell His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, he's a little worried about, the implementation and politician. Then HK is divided, politician, three different fields. The first one is statesman, and second one is typical politician, and third one is like political animals. If we eliminate the way of political animals, characters in the political fields of our geopolitical field, and we will make some change. And I really would like to tell, he's 80 years old, I'm 41 years old. What I mean is like we have, great, we are respecting his legacy and his team's legacy, his generation legacy. Of course, we are respecting our parents and grandparents' generation's will, and we will continue. And then he's the man who gets things done, and then I'm, as a generation to next, like a Y generation actually, and then we are boldly and then intensively stand for democracy and then humankind's will. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Erdenebold Sukhbaatar, for sharing not only your country's accomplishments and compelling vision, but actually your personal connection too, and how I think that has inspired you to contribute toward these goals. It's really, it gives me a lot of food for thought. I mean, I'm personally impressed with the idea of 1 billion trees. And finally, I'd like to invite Mr. Kim to speak to us about his experiences working with others to stimulate green technology development. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First I would like to thank our great, graceful hosts and the co-organizers, the sponsors. And thank you, Mr. Matt Dolbow, for the kind introduction. It's an honor to join all of you this morning and my fellow panelists, Ambassador Kim Chan-woo and Mr. Erdenebold, Member of Parliament from Mongolia. I should point out that Ambassador Kim was the climate ambassador right when I joined the Global Green Growth Institute in 2017. Unfortunately, he left shortly after, and I got to work with his successors. And Mr. Erdenebold, Mongolia is one of the 18 founding members of GGGI, which is a treaty-based intergovernmental organization. So I think by happy chance coincidence, we are forming this nice panel. I started out my career much more than 2 decades ago in academia, right here in Monterey, California, about 1 hour's drive south of here. I grew up in the East Coast, US, and I fell in love with California back then, and it's a great pleasure to be back. As Mr. Dolbow introduced, my name is Dave Kim. I'm a senior advisor to the president and chair. That would be the president of the assembly and chair of the council. It is in one person or one bureau. Currently, that is occupied by His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. So I think the theme is that Mr. Ban Ki-moon is the core that connects all of us somehow. Today, it's a huge privilege, and I would just like to briefly talk about effective climate diplomacy, and then a little bit about what GGGI is doing and how we are contributing to the great fight against the climate crisis. So why climate diplomacy? If you will allow me, before we dive in, I would just briefly like to take a couple steps back and look at the big picture, which I think is always a healthy exercise that I like to do. Climate change is the critical issue of our time. I would dare say human rights, voting rights, equality rights, all of that means little if sea levels are destroying, taking away your country as a small island developing state, or if we don't have air to breathe, or if we don't have water to drink. Very recently, Hurricanes Helene and Milton, I think, was a good reminder of if you're in its pathway and it's becoming more frequent and more intense, some of these political rights that we take for granted and which we value so highly, you're thinking about survival, right? Climate diplomacy plays a crucial, fundamental role in the fight against climate change. Because why? As His Excellency mentioned earlier this morning, the issue, the problem is too big and it's too urgent for any one country. It requires all of us working together. At the international level, it galvanizes ambitions to address climate change and to support the development of the rules set under the UNFCCC and the Paris Climate Agreement. At the national level, it enables countries to set nationally determined contributions to NDCs, access international climate finance, implement mitigation and adaptation measures, and measure, report, and verify those international commitments and make sure that they are being met. And of course, the more cross-sectoral, especially at the national level, the more effective it will be. And I would be remiss if I didn't briefly mention that currently we have quite a few armed conflicts and other types of conflicts throughout the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing violence in the Middle East, so many conflicts in Africa, and even the non-armed conflict throughout the world. These are all huge distractions and diversions that we really don't need. I remember telling my daughter, if you were God and looking down on planet Earth, and you have this existential threat, right? But here we are. What a sad story. We are too busy fighting each other rather than working together. So effective climate diplomacy. In a nutshell, climate diplomacy must be proactive, inclusive, and innovative, leveraging global cooperation and local action to create resilient systems capable of addressing the multifaceted impacts of climate change. And it's just a view of proactive, inclusive, and innovative. On the left-hand side, you see an off-grid lighting system that was selected for GGGI's Greenpreneurs competition in the Philippines in 2023. Philippines is a country composed of more than 7,000 islands, and so off-grid systems such as this would be very beneficial. On the right, you see an internally displaced person, IDP, testing out a solar cooking kit, a mobile one, in Burkina Faso just earlier this year, also a project of GGGI. And in the middle, to capture inclusive are two young people who have contributed very little, naturally, to the climate crisis, but yet will face the bulk of it. So I've come up with a list of 5 elements that I think are required for effective climate diplomacy. And first is multilateral commitment. A critical aspect of climate diplomacy is the commitment to multilateralism. And I think our previous panel discussed and touched upon this. And the commitment to multilateralism, particularly to the implementation of key agreements, such as the Paris Agreement. This commitment involves collective action among countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and work towards common climate goals. And by working collaboratively, nations can create a stronger international framework to tackle climate change and its impacts. Secondly, vulnerable nations. I briefly talked about the SIDSs. His Excellency Ban Ki-moon mentioned it several times earlier this morning. I think it's essential to ensure that vulnerable countries and least developed countries, LDCs, have a voice in climate negotiations. These nations are often disproportionately affected by climate change, yet face significant challenges in engaging effectively in international decision-making processes due to simply limited resources and capacity. Supporting these countries through capacity-building initiatives and funding, this can really enhance their participation in climate diplomacy. And this goes in line with what His Excellency said, leave no one behind, right? It's our moral responsibility. Number 3 is geopolitical awareness. Understanding the implications of climate change on global peace and security, I think, is paramount in climate diplomacy. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier that exacerbates existing issues, such as resource scarcity and migration crises even, potentially leading to more conflict. Addressing these challenges requires diplomatic strategies that encompass both environmental sustainability and stability in international relations. This year we have many important elections, including ours here in the US. And one of the key political issues has been migration and will be migration. And it's not just in the US, correct? It's in Europe, it's all over the world. And as if it was not challenging enough, climate, desertification, crop failures, and many other impacts are creating climate refugees and making it even worse. 4th, diverse stakeholders. Convening various stakeholders and forming effective coalitions, including the governments of diverse countries. That's like the vulnerable and the LDCs that I mentioned, but also private sectors, civil society groups, and academic communities such as this is really crucial for achieving climate diplomacy objectives and enhancing the legitimacy and effectiveness of policies, creating greater buy-in by more groups and more coalitions. This coalition building is also vital for mobilizing financial resources and innovative solutions, especially from the private sector and civil societies, needed for climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. Diverse groups can ensure that strategies are inclusive and reflective of diverse needs and make public diplomacy and advocacy galvanize broader support for ambitious climate action. And we all know it's very strong, especially in the US. Governments, this idea, not governments, that governments can be clumsy, bureaucratic, bloated, ineffective, inherently, and governments just cannot do it alone. And fifth and last, adaptation and innovation. Climate diplomacy should not be seen as a one-time event, but as an ongoing process requiring adaptive strategies that respond to new challenges and changing circumstances. Continuous engagement at both national and international levels will help to build trust and commitment among the stakeholders and allow for the assessment and revision of those commitments based on the effectiveness of ongoing actions. And I think the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement is a good example of that. Traditional methods are not enough to tackle the current climate crisis, and innovative solutions may involve new technologies, adapting successful practices from one region to another, or developing novel partnerships that cross sectoral boundaries. For instance, promoting green technologies in developing countries from advanced countries, and creating innovative financing mechanisms to support such transfers might be innovative. Now I would like to jump into the second half, and rather than pay attention to all of the statistics there, I would like to go ahead and highlight some examples of what GGGI is doing and how it is contributing as a treaty-based intergovernmental organization. GGGI, first of all, is a treaty-based international organization created in 2012 at the Rio Plus 20 conference. So only 12 years old, very young. We currently have 48 member states with 23 in officially the accession process. And its mission is simply to accelerate green growth in its member states and partners with technical assistance, primarily divided into two categories. One, policies, regulations, and the foundations. And secondly, climate finance, because the world works on money, runs on money. And we do this by acting as a trusted delivery partner embedded in the counterpart ministries of our member states and partner countries. And GGGI's value chain, from policy to finance mobilization, has yielded $1.9 billion in finance mobilized for its member states in 2023. GGGI defines green growth as environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive growth. Yes, we do think of growth as essential because all of the developing world countries pursue growth, naturally. But we also emphasize very, very strongly with a focus on poverty reduction, green jobs, improved livelihoods. So as an example of what might be an innovative way that GGGI is working and contributing is the Ecuador Galapagos Debt for Nature swap. GGGI's role was to provide technical and financial advice to structure the Debt for Nature swap. And which led to repurchasing of $1.6 billion of outstanding bonds for the government of Ecuador last year. And it will save Ecuador $1.1 billion in 17 years in debt service repayments. And it will mean $450 million that the government can and then invest into conservation and sustainable activities. The technical assistance for structuring, for transaction, for designing Ecuador's sovereign green bond framework, for coordinating negotiations and formalizing the commitments, servicing third-party credit enhancements with necessary policies and regulations, and building the technical capacity of the local government officials to oversee. There are other similar green or climate or sustainable bonds that GGGI has successfully helped also in Peru, Vietnam, Mexico, Cambodia, and others. And the largest one was in 2022 for Peru, where it ended up with $3.2 billion and 1 billion euros in climate and sustainable bond issuances, respectively. Another example is the GGGI provides Article 6 readiness support, which, as you probably know, is about carbon trading. This, coincidentally, will launch next year, and GGGI will provide support to enable its member states to sell carbon credits under the Paris Agreement by creating the Carbon Trade Facility, CTF. And it will open international carbon trading markets under Article 6 and support governments to put in place frameworks to enable trade. And we do this by focusing around two pillars. One is Article 6 readiness to participate for those member states. And the second is the carbon trust funds to actually trade the ITMOs between member states and other countries interested in carbon trade. GGGI, I mentioned earlier, has 48 member states. About a quarter of those are developed countries: Norway, Denmark, ROK, Australia, UK, UAE. But the majority, about 75%, are developing and LDCs. And so the idea was to match our member states for carbon trade. And we are very excited to launch that next week with a commitment already of over $30 million from just several member states. One last example I would like to share is something that His Excellency helped GGGI launch last year at COP28. And it is the Africa and Middle East SAFE Initiative. SAFE is an acronym for Scaling Up Agriculture and Food Security for Economic Development. It's a mouthful. Basically, the idea was to bring Africa, the African member states, with Middle East member states of GGGI to tap into the natural resources in Africa with the financial resources in the Middle East to enhance food security, to transform food systems, to strengthen resilience of the food supply chains. And the 5 priority projects that GGGI has launched in 2024 has already totaled $1.8 billion. The participating members and partner states of GGGI include Senegal, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Benin, and the African Union. So I would like to stop there and make some time. I believe I have exceeded my time already for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David, for educating us about a multi-stakeholder model of climate diplomacy that, as you said, creates growth, creates jobs, and sounds financially sustainable for all parties involved. I think it's a very concrete description of the way you described effective climate diplomacy. It's proactive, it's inclusive, and it's innovative. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question, and then I believe we're going to have some time for audience Q&A as well. So please start to think of your own questions. I'd like to ask each of the keynote speakers, starting with David, given the urgency of climate action, the roadmaps that we heard from Ambassador Kim, for example, at the multilateral level, effective national models that exist, like the one Mongolia has adopted, and effective multilateral models as well. Thinking about His Excellency Ban Ki-moon's statement that climate action really underlies the ability to achieve all of the SDGs, what is holding us back internationally from being able to propagate these models that we just heard about? You know, what, for example, for David, what's your biggest obstacle to further internationalizing these concepts that you've outlined before us?
Thank you, Matt, for that question. I think it touches upon the last Q&A question from the previous panel also, but and I'll leave room for our two distinguished panelists and focus on one that really has been bugging me a lot, and I mentioned this briefly at the beginning of my speech, is rather than working together, we talked about, the previous panelists talked about the political will and the financing, the resources, and all of these ideas, but rather than putting those together, rather than trying to put those together, we are fighting at the macro level, with the Russian invasion, the Middle East conflict. And I cannot get over it, and you mentioned when you introduced me, my first career was in academia, and I focused on international security, non-proliferation, weapons of mass destruction. And so I keep levitating towards that, and it really bothers me personally that you have governments like Russia, you have these conflicts in the Middle East, and I think you can't underestimate the amount of diversion and distraction, because when you are so focused on those types of conflicts, and you're expending all of your not only financial resources and military assets, but diplomatic efforts, your waking hour thinking about it, your brain power. I think it's probably the biggest issue and biggest hurdle for us as a world, as an international community, to come together and to come up with something concrete, right, for international climate diplomacy. If we can get over that, and I think that would be the first step, then we could come up, because even without it, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon has told me before many times how in 2015, the negotiations for Paris, it's historic, but even that was during peacetime, and that was really, really difficult. But when you have these types of extreme conflicts and distractions, I can't see how, it's almost a non-starter. And I think we really need to get over that, and for me, it's really hard to get over it.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's definitely food for thought for the rest of us. Next, a very similar question, maybe a little different take on it, for Mr. Erdenebold Sukhbaatar. You outlined for us what sounds like a really effective and innovative national model. We heard in the first panel discussion about the difficulties of assembling political stakeholders for the hard work of building the coalitions to agree on innovative models of addressing complex problems. So I'd like to ask you, what was a key challenge that you faced and overcame in putting together this plan that Mongolia has adopted for climate?
I think the sustainable policy means is sustainable, also positive leadership challenges. And His Excellency mentioned about implementation. And then also you said that you politicians, in the student time, they're just learning good knowledge, and then when they take power and then they change their mind, It is somehow, it is true. And then now, frankly saying, last 4 years, about 4 to 5 years, we are seeing a great conflicts and great crisis, especially leadership crisis. A few years ago, under your leadership, you collected 160 state leaders in Paris. Now it is more difficult, getting more worse. Russian versus Ukraine and weaponizing, and then everywhere people is preparing somehow
I'm just telling like World War III maybe, it is the difficult condition. And in this case, the main problem is, of course, it is the mindset. And then also obstacle and challenge always related with also populism, and without any wise intent, then humankind, just getting to the worst condition, which is everywhere. During the election, we are seeing the big shadow of the social media is just used by populists, weaponized points, and which is like, how can we find and how can we save and how can we, stand for the pure mind to humankind and pure heart to humankind, pure will to next generation. This is great challenging points. Of course, we can name any kind of papers and agenda and scenarios, but what exactly the most important thing is the leadership will. And then also I'm really happy that His Excellency is still, worrying about our next generation, and then still, taking care of next generation. And the big obstacle is deeply related with leadership. And leadership will is also linked to our value and principle of free society and democracy. And of course, being two giant countries, one is Russia, is always, they have a troubling point against with neighbors. And then we cannot loudly, boldly saying, because if somebody, in the morning of some day, if we loudly telling it is brutal case against Russia, they can stop the gas and electricity. It's difficult, Also, we are exporting our mining, products to China, and then also it is also difficult. And then this gentleman who is sitting there, our former president, and one of the leader of democratic revolution, Mr. Victor Sahel. So, he's loudly saying principle and democratic messages to the worldwide. Mongolian politician, as a politician and as a newly elected member of parliament, of course, we can say the principles, but we cannot say directly to our neighbors. This is the challenge. Of course, we really want to stand for democracy and human values, but that is the challenge. And then Mr. Zandshatar Kwamjo mentioned, as a big nations, like America, such a kind of European countries, also they have more, of course, obligations. We can support. We really want to support, which is idea of democracy and value of democracy. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And speaking of those, obligations of big countries around the world, I want to return to the presentation by Ambassador Kim, who outlined, I think, really ambitious goals, including, financial penalties for non-compliance with climate commitments, as well as convening a high-level experts group at the UN that would assess possible updates that would make climate commitments not voluntary as they were in the past. So I think the question about implementation and political will and assembling diverse stakeholders across party lines is really critical for anything that's kind of that far-reaching in its vision and scope. So for Ambassador Kim, what do you see as key obstacles to the two proposals that you've made, and how would you propose to kind of overcome them in a way that's inclusive?
Thank you very much. My suggested ideas cannot be implemented immediately, and then the right timing will come, and then this timing will be dictated by climate crisis. The low probability of implementation will become a high probability on those ideas. And then according to Bill Gates, he identified 3 elements to address climate change crisis. He identified the 3 elements are policy and technology and market. Policy is created by climate change regime and followed by national governments. And then they are providing time for international community to move towards and to act. And then in the case of technology, we should think of both conventional technologies and future new innovative technologies. At present, we are utilizing conventional technologies, but in order to reach net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050, we need new and innovative technologies. Last year in Dubai, on the basis of the global stocktake, apart from renewable energies, that document mentioned nuclear and hydrogen and the carbon capture and storage technologies. At present, those technologies have a lot of great potential to address climate challenges. However, money hasn't been fully mobilized to develop and deploy those technologies. And then over time, we should develop those future technologies for them to play, to address. My personal thinking about why international community is so slow to address climate crisis, because there is no, at least, we don't have effective tools. If we have effective tools to address climate change, why couldn't we hold back a climate crisis? Because we don't have enough effective tools. In it, among effective tools, technologies will play a key role. So we should channel money, as His Excellency Mr. Ban already mentioned, around the world. We have plenty of resources, financial resources. How to channel these resources into technology development and deployment? That is the question. Policy and climate change regime and the national government will do those kind of jobs, and then technology will be developed by the private sector and the market.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great kind of closing point before we go on to audience Q&A. I mean, if there's any place in the world that unites policy, technology, and market-based solutions, it should be right here at Stanford University, I think. So it's a great forum for this discussion. With that, are there any audience members who would like to ask a question? Please go up to the microphones. None so far. So I will then ask another question. Related to my comment, what kind of role would you like to see universities like this one, like Stanford, playing in supporting your ambition? And to just make it more concrete, what would you like Stanford to do as an outcome of this dialogue in 2024 that you think would help you to move the ball forward on the goals that you've outlined? And any of the three of you who'd like to address that.
At present, the collaboration format is the public sector and the government, and then private sector and the academia all should gather their role, and then in providing solutions. Stanford University is very well positioned in playing those kind of role. So as an innovation hub, and the Stanford could provide some kind of results, and then those results could be utilized by private sector, businesses, and etc. So technologies which will be utilized fully. The start should from the university.
Would either of the two of you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that the Ambassador Kim has mentioned. And this event is a bit like that, right? It's cross-sectoral. We have officials here. You are with a State Department. I'm with a treaty-based intergovernmental organization. We have civil society. We have people from the private sector. And of course, this is an academic setting. So that cross-sectoral is very important. And I think GGGI, as I mentioned in my presentation, how we bring those players together in order to find the financing, the innovative mechanisms, financial mechanisms to bring the private sector together with the public sector, which is powered by the civil society and academic worlds. I think that along the line is crucial. So basically, again, to re-emphasize that diversity and inclusive stakeholder, I think that's the key.
Great. Anything you'd like to add?
Then in Mongolia, we are working on the national security policy strategic paper. And during the COVID 2 years, technologies, speed is about 1 decade speed, reached about 10 years. I heard that during the World War II, within 4 years, technology speed fastened 45 years, 40 to 45 years. Now, which is during the COVID time, and we are more using technology, and then our kids, they can, remotely, using technologies, and then they listen to our classes also remotely. And then also, the first thing is just refreshing knowledge and data from this, dialogue. Second thing is also we need to change our the points. What is the new reality, after COVID? And then also it is 2024 is just 5 years and just 3 months left. SDG, we need to it is until 2030, just 5 more years left. But then reality is, it is just 20%, the quality and implementation is. Where is more than 70%, And then also, which is even this conclusion is closing to us, but we need to think about after 2030, 2040, 50, It is, everything is just the question come-ups. We need to take it seriously. We means I heard that many times, collaboration and cooperation and unifying, unity. And I think this dialogue number 3 makes somehow great wave and great shake, to the person who has to make solution, who has to make policy. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think that this panel of keynotes and the Q&A has really provided an effective framework as we move forward into the afternoon as well as tomorrow to think through examples of industrial and infrastructure development that's both innovative as well as sustainable. And I hope that we'll continue to keep in mind some of the concepts from the first panel discussion as well about how to move forward into implementation and ensure that our kind of political models are themselves sustainable in terms of reaching across the aisle to all parties to come up with effective coalitions to drive change. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to our 3 presenters, and we look forward to the rest of the discussion today and tomorrow.